CJ, and it's good to be back here in the Redwoods. The Redwoods are surprisingly similar to some of the forests in the eastern United States because of the way they behave with fire, and that's been a puzzle for fire scientists like myself for quite some time now. Why it is that forests so close to the coast can have so much evidence of fire, yet at the same time be so humid and apparently in some ways unburnable. And so what I'm going to talk about today is research that I conducted beginning maybe a year and a half ago with the help of Chet Hogan up in Del Norte Coast Redwood State Park with some money from Save Redwood. Same time Garth was up there looking for little crawlies. I was working with Chet to trying to understand how these trees, these magnificent trees that had been logged decades earlier, created a forest that was absolutely spectacular. And when we do think of redwood forests up in the northern part of the range, we think about this. This is Prairie Creek. It's a pretty humid area, not too far away from Elk Prairie. A very humid place. It's not the sort of place you think that can set on fire. When you think of small-scale patch disturbance dynamics, this is the Arcata Community Forest, not too far away from where we're sitting. Blowdown events like this are kind of big. And in a humid forest, we'd expect small patch dynamics to be the way things operate. And at even a smaller scale, you get a little bear in there, strips the bark off a redwood tree now and again. It's not the sort of thing that is really what you see in the interior. This is a satellite view from earlier this year, and all the smoke shows up in the just left of the middle part of the screen from ignitions from that lightning storm, and on the coast you have the fog. That's what keeps it relatively humid, and we think of it as being relatively stable. The fog stays there. And if you look, even in 1881, where the most superlative redwoods supposedly were, where do they put them? They put them basically where that persistent fog tends to be, not farther east. It's a little bit colder there. Their fire burns a little differently. So it's not really, we don't think about fire and redwood together. We think of fire and fog. That's what comes to people's mind. And it's a bit of a problem when you know what the indicators for fire are, and the people in this lab have known that for some time. You look at a redwood hollow to find bats. You look at a redwood hollow because they're interesting. If you bring tourists, that's what the kids want to climb in. There's redwood hollows everywhere. The most obvious indicator of fire there is. There's a lot of others, not the least of which is fire itself. And in Humboldt Redwoods State Park, in 2003, we had a rather significant fire, the canoe fire, which is burning the tree in the middle. And it kind of brought fire to our attention. It's not just something that happened once in a while in the past. It's potentially something that's as much as a concern for the welfare of the forest and sustainability of the magnificent old growth, the most magnificent forest perhaps in the world. We don't know much about fire behavior, about fire risk, and about the implications of not having fire in there anymore. So from that initial study that I conducted with people from the state park, I've expanded a little bit into headwaters, where I have an interesting project with Greg Jennings, and a few other places. And even up in north, this is the mouth of Mill Creek in Jed Smith State Park. And you can see some evidence of fire there if you know what to look for in this aerial photo. In the left center, there's this textural difference in the forest. It's because that's Doug fir, young Doug fir. It's because it's hardwoods. And you can see it in that forest, even though that event, that hotter event, happened decades and decades, maybe a century ago. So there's this sort of evidence of fire if you know what to look for everywhere. And it's not necessarily going to be something we can keep out, as we learned in the canoe fire. And the ability of redwood trees to sustain themselves with fire is not something we should just assume, because these trees are really old, and they used to burn a lot. And if they burn again, there's a lot of fuel there that can scar them and damage them in ways that's not characteristic of the past. And of course there's marble murrelets there and spotted owls and a wonderful conservation resource. And we'd be happiest if it didn't change radically. So to really get a good picture about this, we got to think about the Redwood Range and how it varies. And of course, the key disturbance gradient everybody likes to think about is the latitudinal gradient. Incoming solar radiation makes a big difference in terms of how much solar radiation there is. I'm surprised by how late it was for the sun to come up, because I haven't been at this latitude lately. Latitude makes a big difference. The storm tracks also are important for non-fire disturbance, but for wind disturbance. And that opens the gaps and can change fire behavior. It's a complex system. The other fantastic gradient that everybody is so much aware of up here is the gradient of coastal influence, east and west. And it's not just east and west, it conforms a little bit to topography. The general slate shape of the valleys changes where the fog stratus cover tend to see, as we saw in those earlier slides. But there's perhaps more important just a buffering effect of the proximity of the ocean that affects temperature, and that of course affects how fire is going to burn. So this is spatial and temporal. Coastal influence varies over time based on the fog stratus cover, and the temperature effect is more or less constant, except that it's regulated by the cloud cover. A third fantastic gradient that's been appreciated since Robert Whittaker's classic work in the Klamath Siskiyous was published in 1960, right after he, by the way, published his great gradient study in the Great Smoky Mountains, near where I'm at now, and then replicated in Humboldt Redwoods by Warren and Major in the early 60s, is topography. Topography varies with vegetation for a reason. Vegetation is influenced by it for all sorts of reasons. Different radiation, different temperature, different fire behavior because of the temperature difference on slopes. And of course, if a fire comes through, the different fuel moistures will affect the fire behavior as well. Topography also affects wind exposure, which again has this feedback with gap formation and fire behavior. So topography is largely spatial, it's largely permanent, but it does vary because soil moisture and wind exposure mostly is going to vary over time based on the position of storm tracks. But for the most part, it's just a spatial factor. And of course, fourth is cultural. Of course, no one thinks about this. This is my great gradient number 4 that I think is underappreciated. And Prometheus here is, of course, not a Native American god. He's a Greek hero who brought fire to the world. And I use that image because I really don't have anything else. But the importance of gradients of ignition can't be underappreciated here. We don't have much lightning on the coast. And so most of the ignitions in the past and present are really people. People change over time. Their culture changes over time, just like climate. So this is very much a spatial and temporal gradient here. So if any of you were ever children, you may have seen this before. It's called the fire triangle. And you throw a little bit of heat, oxygen, and fuel together. Heat is the ignition. And you end up with a fire. And if we think of this in a sophisticated way, in terms of not what makes a fire, but what makes a fire regime, instead of just heat, we're talking about an ignition source and the pattern of it, how that changes over time. Instead of oxygen, we're dealing with climate variability and change over time. And fuel is related to all sorts of things, time since last fire, vegetation dynamics, all sorts of interacting processes, and of course management. Redwood is not particularly fuel limited. This is 1 year after the Canoe Fire. A lot of the leaves that were scorched by the fire fell. You'd think about if a fire was burning frequently, there wouldn't be so much understory that would be able to scorch. You might not have this. But the evidence shows in a lot of places, from at least Humboldt Redwoods south, that fires recurred with less than 3-year intervals sometimes. I think I even have a 1-year fire interval in Humboldt Redwoods. So if there's enough ignition and if the climate's right, it is possible to burn a redwood forest on a yearly basis. Whether that's true everywhere or farther north, it's hard to say, but there's no shortage of fuels. I mean, anybody who walks outside can see that in the fall. However, redwood, even not fuel limited, is very much climate limited and ignition limited, as I've referred to. The climate ignitability of the climate affects the ignitability of the landscape because of the fuel moisture and the cloud cover largely, which is going to vary over time based on the strength of the high pressure system and possible climate change in the next 50 years. The ignition, of course, varies with both what culture you're from and how how well behaved you are within our current culture. Whether or not you want to call it ignition, arson or not, is a cultural concept. And in the past, people didn't worry about such things, and so there was an awful lot of fire. And one of these fires was, or one of these cultural fires is best explained here in this northern coast redwood region by this fellow named Klamath River Jack, who in a letter from 1916 wrote or said that fire burns up the old acorns that are on the ground, and that's where the weevils live. And if you don't do that, you're going to have a less successful harvest, and so they burn every year. They don't want their mainstay, their food stuff, their tan oak acorns, to be lost, and so this is a key part of their culture. Now, I used to have a garden, and I moved here, and I did not. And so where I'm at now, I have a little garden. And it's a small little garden, much smaller than this room. And right before I came, I harvested some of the beans, the string beans that I failed to pick while they were still green. And I have a quarter handful. That's a lot of work I put into that garden, a little tiny handful of beans. It's hard to have enough food to eat, and so they had to manage a fairly large landscape, even for some smaller villages. This is something we take for granted today, but they really did nurture the landscape. And a lot of these tan oak groves are orchards. It's the best way to think about it. So here's Chet in Mill Creek with a chainsaw, properly dressed with protection equipment. And in this particular stump, this is a very wet site. This is one of the most humid sites I've ever collected from, other than the experimental forest. And Chet was instrumental in this, as I said. And the purpose of the study up in Del Norte, Coast Redwood, is to better understand how fire regimes are relating to these climates, these gradients of climate and ignition. If we have a lot of fire up here, and previous people who looked at this back in the 70s, this area, thought that there wasn't. A few fires per millennium. Even in dry sites, maybe 50 years there might be a fire. For methodological reasons, we haven't trusted that for about 20 years, that information. But no one's really gone out there and collected information from such a humid site. So if we can find this, we'd expect to see some conformation to these four gradients I talked about. Farther north, well, you'd expect there to be less fire. That's what he said. How much less? That's what's on the table. That's the critical question. We'd expect to see an east-west gradient. We'd expect to see a topographic gradient and a cultural burning gradient, because this area was peopled for centuries. And this is a zoom in of the Mill Creek Annex within Del Norte Coast Redwood State Park. Crescent City is to the upper left, and the river that's running north and south on the right is Rock Creek. And the triangles, the white triangles, are where we collected fire history information, and then we have a lot of young Douglas fir cuts that were just cut in the late 90s that have that were in good enough condition still to do some simple age structure. And unfortunately, the real good stuff was long, long ago. This area had been first logged well over 100 years ago. And the Doug fir tend to rot really, really fast up there because it's so humid in the winter. But I did find a handful of nice, fresh, dug-for clear cuts that were able to provide some information. And this data here is from Redwood, and it's problematic to cross-date Redwood. There's all sorts of discussions we could go in on that. But if you just come up with as good approximation as you want and use the fire intervals within individual stumps as your indicator, you can get a pretty good idea about what the fire intervals are. And instead of finding fire intervals of, say, 200 years in some of these humid redwood sites, we find that the peak fire interval is less than 15 years. This is the wettest redwood forest that anyone's ever looked at. And we're talking about an interval, fire interval, of less than 15 years, sometimes up to 90 years, not 200. Not only is the average not 200, I don't have anything coming close to 200 in these handful of sites that I looked at that cover this moisture gradient. You can see that there's a major increase less than 35 years. I think that all of those high intervals, for the most part, not all of them, but a good number of them, probably had fires that weren't recorded. And I would think that even a lot of those fires less than 35 years were missing a few intervals that would push them lower. And you might say, well, this is just crazy. How can a redwood forest like this have sustained such frequent fire intervals? And the answer, of course, is by the fact there were people there burning for at least the last few centuries. And you can get some insight into that by looking at how these fire intervals map out along two different gradients. East and west here on these graphics is a coastal influence gradient. So as you go toward the yellow, you're more interior, and you go toward the left, the blue is closer to the coast, where it's more humid, where the temperature is lower, where you'd expect there to be less evidence of fire. And up and down on the y-axis is a moisture index. So it's just basically, it's my moisture index, which relates to slope, aspect, and elevation, mostly aspect. It's what's driving it. So the riparian areas, the more humid north-facing slopes are up at the top, and the drier upper south-facing slopes are at the bottom. Now, closing your eyes for a minute and thinking, where would you expect to see the longest fire intervals, the average or the median fire interval, where it's wettest? So that would be in the upper left-hand corner of each graph. Do we see that? No, I don't see that here at all. If we look at the maximum fire interval, though, something happens. We have an explosion in the western half of the graph. The long fire intervals do tend to occur there. And if you look at the minimum, you know, again, the patterns everywhere. There's short fire intervals that can occur anywhere in this watershed. But those super long fire intervals are associated with the more coastal areas. Is that significant? I think that's incredibly significant. That's because of the changes in Native American density in those areas. Those long fire intervals happened after the late 1700s. And what we have from the ethnographic record is evidence of the early expeditions, and they began in, 1779, I think, in Trinidad. Vancouver was in the 1793, I believe, and then the Russians came in with their sea for expeditions beginning in the early 1800s, repeatedly, over and over again. That, you know, these people had tools, they had cultural artifact changes that are related to trade that's taking place during those early decades. And I think that there was a cholera epidemic here, just like we have record of there being one in the area near Crescent City in that period before 1850. And I think that that loss of humans in this landscape, loss of a village, is what led to the increase in fire intervals there. I think this is testimony to the fact that a group of people were killed off by disease, which is a wonderful story if it's true, because that's never really been documented in too many places with this sort of information. So change in intervals, a big clue about the nature of the fire regimes here. The second is the seasonality of the fires. And this is a nice fire scar here that's occurring early in the growing season. Hard to say exactly when, maybe June. And we know that Native Americans tended to burn early rather than later in the season. They did burn early and late in different places for different reasons. But it was to their benefit to burn earlier than, maybe not this current fire season, but earlier than fires would normally burn because of the specific needs they wanted because of the specific reasons that they had to burn. They wanted to burn before the acorns fell, for instance. And this early season fire is associated with a shorter fire interval. That's on the y-axis, the mean fire interval. Early season fires during the period 1700 to 1849 are about 15 years, and the dormant season fires in this landscape occur at a 10-year longer interval on average. It's amazing, because it changes after 1850. It's almost a reverse in the pattern. And that's because the Europeans, the settlers, the miners who came on the scene, they didn't have that same cultural need. They didn't subside on tan oak acorns. And so that's a major change in their cultural ecology. Now, on a broader scale, when we're dealing with redwoods that can live for 1,000 years or so, we really have to think big long term. And this slide is very telling. As much as we can infer, the different tribes up and down the coast, for the most part, have just come in fairly recently. And the Yurok and the Wiyot have been here a little bit longer, about 1,100 years, 1,300 years or so. There were earlier people here going back thousands and thousands of years, but the evidence suggests that they were not as dense in the landscape as what happened in the last millennium. And you know, the people are coming in, you see in these key archaeological sites a cultural change in their artifacts and everything. It doesn't tell you much about their relative importance on the landscape. That's just guesswork for the most part. I think that the evidence that I have from fire scars can indicate landscape level fire use by people, suggests that they really didn't pick up until the last 500 years or so. And you can see that there's all sorts of there's an increase in all these neighboring tribes all the way up and down the north coast about that time. And their influence diminished after 1850, but the fires persisted because of the Europeans who picked up the same tradition until fires were suppressed by mandate. Now, what's interesting is this east-west gradient. And if you move to the easternmost edge of Mill Creek, this is what it looked like before logging. This is 1850, and all the large little peppered trees in there, those are giant old-growth redwood. Some of them established about 1,500, some about 200 years after that. But they're really beautiful trees, and they tend to be in riparian areas, but not entirely. They almost appear like a redwood savanna in the sea of finer stuff. And you might say, well, what is that finer stuff? That's the amazing part. That finer stuff is young Doug fir trees that tended to live only a couple decades, and it's hardwoods. And there's a complex tan oak, madrone, all sorts of shrubs. There's rhododendron mixed in here in different places, berberis, huckleberry. There's an amazing assortment of shrubs. It's an incredibly rich place. And that used to burn. It used to burn every 7 to 26 years on average here. And, you know, a mile and a half to the northeast, there's archaeological evidence of people burning, and that would have come down the hill potentially. It's kind of hard to know how far fire would spread there. But from this age data, you can see there's this older cohort of redwood, and then there's a fire here, and there's a pulse in Douglas fir, and the slashed bar is knobcone pine, which is kind of interesting. It's mixed in there with the Doug fir. And then there's another fire. It killed off quite a few trees, but it kept a few alive. They can survive at least 2 fire cycles, which tells us that these fires were not hot fires. There's another pulse that came in. Now that's all been logged in the last 10 years. But this is the way it probably went on, given the persistence of that fire interval. This is the way it probably went on. The fires were of modest severity. They torched the understory. The redwoods are there. They're doing fine. If you look at the redwoods, they don't have any strong suppressions on them, suggesting that they were damaged that much by these fires. But that the fires were burning, and they were hot enough to kill a good part of the Doug fir and initiate knobcone pine, for Pete's sake. It's amazing. And as this grows back up, and if we exclude fire from this dry eastern part of the watershed, the question on my mind is, well, what's the fire hazard here? We're not that far away. We're outside the principal fog zone here, and it seems to me quite possible that there can be
hot fires here, hotter than we want, that preclude the development and the restoration of this redwood. Now, it's my opinion that these redwoods that you see here 50 years ago, before it was logged, were actually eroded. That forest used to be more extensive, and over the centuries it was gradually eroded by these Native American fires that initiated probably at higher intensity only in the last 500 years. It's hard to know for sure. It's my suspicion. So that east-west pattern is really critical. The eastern part of this little orange triangle is where we just were. You move closer to the coast, things are different, but still there was an ability of that forest to burn. Now that fog line, if you will, is going to vary over time, and this is just the last century of fog in Eureka. It comes and it goes. Complex process. There's no question in my mind that the importance of fog, and therefore the ability of the redwood forest to burn in the future, is going to be highly contingent on the climatological processes that are controlling this. And they're not as well understood as they need to be. So this may be more of our future. This is the tree in the middle is burning in the canoe fire. We have a redwood here. You know, it's probably 500 years old, if not more. Burned through. Now it's almost a stilt tree. What you see on the left, though, is what I'm really concerned about. A hot fire like the canoe fire doesn't create these goose pens. Instead, what it does is it just makes these long scars up and down the tree, which then, in an old model of thinking of how these fire cavities form, very gradually may increase over time. It's not going to be something that really causes a catastrophic excavation. But in headwaters, I changed my mind on that model completely because I saw this. These trees seem to be excavating through a different process. There, the fires did not exist. The Native Americans weren't there with any high prevalence till after 1850, and the fires doubled in frequency because of the white settlers. And so you see a different response of the old-growth redwood to this change, decadal-long change in regimes. And I'm worried about that. In places like Mill Creek, that still may have a fire risk over the coming century. So, just to wrap up here, my take-home points: even these humid redwood forests are capable of burning. They did in the past. And it's because of human influence. It's not because of lightning in most cases. And these drier interior sites, even way north in Del Norte County, where we don't think of it, I think have a real potential severe fire risk that may lead us down a path that we don't desire, except now that it's all second growth, it's greatly increased. Most important thing, though, is that these regimes, the disturbance regimes in the coast redwood forest, and therefore the redwood forest itself, the compositional and structural attributes that we desire so much, are not something that just happens because of time, and it's something that the forest will recover back to in time, but it's something that reflects its very long history of change. It goes back centuries. The trees that were out there that we're able to see as with basal hollows, and the Douglas fir that provide important marble murrelet nests, not just the redwood, but the Douglas fir component, represent Native American fires of 500 years ago and the initiation that afforded the forest. The forest that we see results from history. It doesn't result from some disturbance recovery process that tends to dominate our minds. So for me, that's the most important thing. Think about the forest a little bit differently.